So I'm Caroline, and Samir, you can introduce yourself too. I'm from Williams, class of 2023, and we're both on the exec board for the Williams Finance Club, and we're here to talk about corporate governance.
Hey everyone, excited to talk to you all today. I'm Samir Jain, class of 23. And yeah, let's get started. All right, so first and foremost, let's talk about what exactly corporate governance is. And we're going to talk about this from more of a fundamental perspective, like what is corporate governance? So in its essence, corporate governance is the way that the relationship between the shareholders and managers kind of is regulated or is kind of based on. So obviously, we see managers are the ones that are going to be the ones running the company day to day. So these are the CEO, CFO, all those individuals, and then we have the shareholders. So that's the people that are putting their money up in the company. And so what the shareholders need to do or what their goal is to get the highest return possible, to make their investment worthwhile. And that means that they need to have a way to kind of make sure that the decision makers of the company, i.e. the managers, are doing what they should be. And the managers are obviously their own individuals, and they are not necessarily big shareholders in the companies, which means that their goals might not be the same as the shareholders. And that's because they get paid kind of regardless of if the stock price goes up a lot of times. And so things like that really create a divide, I guess, in the interests of the shareholders and the managers. And so corporate governance kind of comes into play here as a way for shareholders to kind of make sure that managers are doing what they should be doing. And so here, just a quick example, Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs was kind of an indispensable manager of Apple. And when he kind of passed on, Apple was left with a big hole in the company because he was so important. So he kind of entrenched himself in the company, which is something we'll talk a little bit more about later on. But that left a big hole in the company, and that's not good for corporate governance, obviously. And so this is a problem that was kind of created because of non-perfect corporate governance. Obviously, there's no such thing as perfect corporate governance, but this is an issue that could have been mitigated if action was taken earlier on. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly happened there later, but that's kind of an introduction of what exactly we're going to be talking about.
So why is corporate governance important? It's not necessarily the first thing you think of when you think of things that are crucial to success of a company, and that investors should be concerned about. But because of its regulation of what we'll talk about with the agency problems and transparency to investors, it's absolutely vital to the success of a firm. It won't necessarily make the success, but it absolutely can cause a downfall or a crisis. So having these measures in place is very important. And in the bottom right, I have the 4 fundamental pillars of corporate governance. They're all somewhat related, but accountability, transparency, responsibility, and fairness. And these 4 key values are what will keep the wheels of the company going. And as a result, when all these things are in place, ultimately everyone's happy. The more access to capital and shareholders will come, and the firm will grow, the shareholders' value will grow, and everyone wins.
So as we kind of mentioned already, there's a big problem that kind of comes due to the difference in interest between the managers and the shareholders. And this is called the agency problem. So obviously the managers are the ones that are making the decisions for the firm. And this means that they're the ones that essentially can decide what direction the firm goes in. And obviously the shareholders want one thing, but the shareholders aren't the ones that are managing the company in most cases. And we're kind of going to assume that for the most part in this presentation. And that means that the shareholders need to have a way to kind of make sure that the manager acting in their best interest, and that's kind of where corporate governance comes in to try to address this principal agent problem.
And so corporate governance comes in many different forms. Generally, the first one is a proprietorship where there's no separation of ownership and control. And that's your classic entrepreneur, startup, very concentrated in one team. And ultimately, it will progress to these different forms, whether it's a partnership, shareholder owned corporations, that's your common publicly traded firm, worker owned corporations, supplier owned corporations, customer owned, which commonly known as a co-op, and not-for-profit, which generally doesn't have owners or managers the same way because their goals aren't profits, but will have a board of trustees, an endowment, things like that. And just a fun example of a co-op with customer owned is if any of you know the Mad River Glen ski area, you as the customer in a skier can buy a share for, I think it's like $2,000, and then you and all the other shareholders, rather than a big corporation, are what help run the resort and keep everything, make all the decisions. So they definitely still exist, and it's a really kind of neat niche form of corporate governance and forms.
And so one thing to add there actually, so what a big kind of conflict that comes in a lot of these companies is that there's some kind of I guess tension between corporations and customers in terms of price setting especially. So customers obviously want lower prices and corporations want to set higher prices kind of by nature of profit maximization. And so one thing that's unique about customer corporations is that that kind of conflict there no longer exists because these customer-owned corporations typically charge higher prices, but at the end, all the profits are essentially going back to the customers, so that conflict is heavily mitigated in this case. And so now just talking a little bit more from the perspective of a starting company. So when a company kind of first goes out and raises equity. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more through an example. So what we're going to say is that there's an entrepreneur who wants to raise who needs to raise $25 million in order to fund a project whose present value is $100 million. And so first of all, why would the entrepreneur go and raise this capital and give up value? So the only reason that this would happen is if the entrepreneur cannot undertake the project without this capital. Because in that case, there's zero value, and the entrepreneur benefits obviously because now they get some value at least, which is greater than no value. So that's kind of like a very basic economics behind it. But then going into how corporate governance comes into play here, so that's going to come into play mostly through the investment structure. So the way in which the investor will, like the terms in which the investor will put up capital. So there are kind of two main possibilities here. And the first one is that the investor believes that the entrepreneur will not act opportunistically. And what that means is the investor believes that the entrepreneur will act in the best interest of the project and the shareholders, which means that the entrepreneur will not act in their own best interests. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second case, but right now that means that the investor truly believes that the value of their investment will be 25% of the company because we have $100 million present value of the project, which means that they will invest their $25 million for 25% of the project. Now, this is usually not the case. This is usually not what you see. And this is because the investor may not think that the entrepreneur will not act opportunistically. And so what does that mean? That means the entrepreneur will act in their own best self-interest, which will be a change from the case in which they did not have the money. So let me try to talk us through an example. I think that might have sounded a little confusing. So what that means, so the investor might think that as soon as this entrepreneur gets his hand on the $25 million, he or she will cut themselves a $10 million check. So what does that mean? That means that the project is no longer worth that $25 million for 25%. So in terms of the investment will change. We're not going to go through the math here, but essentially they will still invest so that they get $25 million of present value for their investment. And again, another kind of version of this case is that if the investor believes that the entrepreneur will not outlive the length of the project, and they think that the next person who comes in might act opportunistically, their investment terms will change. And there's many other cases that can happen, but those are kind of the basics here. So the investment structure is definitely altered by kind of the managerial temptations, you could say, that they expect the entrepreneur to succumb to. And that is actually a form of corporate governance here.
So this key problem is that the managerial incentives do not necessarily line up with those of the entrepreneur, the shareholders. And theoretically, managers are hired and paid usually a pretty good salary to act on behalf of the shareholders and kind of take care of the firm for them. But in reality, all these managers are still human and still acting primarily in their own interests. And there's a whole kind of range of different ways this self-interest can manifest itself and kind of tempt the managers to act in ways that aren't necessarily in the interest of the shareholders, and both legal and illegal. And this behavior isn't necessarily that common, but it can be extremely detrimental to a company and its success, its bottom line. One crisis can derail an entire firm. So this governance is extremely important in restraining any rare but possibly severe possibilities of temptation.
So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the illegal temptations that we see. So, I mean, the first one, theft, that is pretty self-explanatory. So that is when money from the company is kind of taken by some executive usually and used for something else. So a common example that we've seen in some cases is that an executive takes money and from the company and puts it into a trust fund or something like that for themselves, or I mean for their own purposes, not for the company, of course. So that's kind of one of the big things, and that's very easy to detect. So it does not happen very often. And then we have fraud. So this one we see through, something like Enron or recently Wirecard. So this is usually involved with the manipulation of your financials, and essentially you're making the company look like something that it's not. And that's obviously a big problem you're going to get into with the SEC and whatnot. So, and that's typically something managers do for their own personal gain. Obviously, that's not in the best interest of the shareholders. Then we have insider trading. So trading on public information. This is very common. Of course, insider trading can be legal and illegal. Here we're talking mainly about illegal. But obviously this is also not very good for the shareholders if this is happening. Then we have tunneling. So this one is a little more complicated to kind of understand, or actually even more to prove. And that's because tunneling is when it typically happens when you have someone, on the board who sits on multiple boards. So this is someone who might be on the board of a couple of companies, and what they do is they take business from this company and give it to that one, kind of just to benefit themselves. So that's one kind of easy example to understand, but this can be extremely difficult to prove just by the nature of it, and obviously not a good thing to do since it's illegal. And then bribes, of course, these are extremely difficult to detect. And of course, they happen very often, as we might imagine, but again, that's pretty self-explanatory. And so now we'll move on to more of the legal forms of misconduct.
So most of these conflicts and misconduct are not actually illegal because most managers are vetted pretty well and not criminals, want to serve the company and the shareholders. But there are a couple things that still come into play that aren't actually against the law. The first is empire building. This is misallocation of resources where you might have excess profits and you're deciding whether to maximize shareholder value versus putting it back in the firm or taking it for their own purposes. And a lot of times, managers are more loyal to their company that they directly work for, they're emotionally invested in, than to an almost faceless changing shareholder. And so an example would be instead of, if there's some excess capital, they might put it back into research and development, or kind of building up the company rather than paying out a dividend or buying back shares, things that would be in the shareholders' interests. And this isn't necessarily bad, but it can cause conflict and further shows this kind of misalignment of interests. And entrenchment is where a individual, usually senior executive, can make themselves indispensable and incentivized to prioritize their own compensation over the shareholder wealth. Again, back to the Steve Jobs example, where Steve Jobs was Apple. He did a great job managing the firm, but ultimately they did have to figure out how to survive without him. And when a single individual is so entrenched in the firm, it can be hard for others not to grant whatever financial compensation they think they deserve. And this can be all right, but it can also be problematic depending on the situation.
And just one thing to add here. So empire building is something that's kind of difficult to understand in some cases, just because a lot of times we think that the goal of the company is to grow. And for shareholders, that's not necessarily the case, because growing the company probably means less returns in a lot of cases. And so managers obviously have the incentive to grow the company, not only for their own kind of compensation, but also because they want to be the leader of a bigger company. And that, like, there's issues like that, like because they're a person, like there's obviously things that they want or think about. So things like that also come into play, and it's not like purely like about the money in all circumstances, but it's like also reputation, things of that nature can kind of collide there. And empire building, though we think that's usually the goal of the company in order to get bigger, it's not always best for shareholders.
And again, all these people are still human, and a big part of this can be ego and their own careers. And um, it's very easy to just think of them as names on a page, but um, still human too.
Absolutely. So managerial compensation, this is kind of one of the big ways in which corporate governance is attempted to be addressed. So obviously, executive compensation, as many of us might know, comes in many forms. So you've got a base salary, you've got bonuses, you've got stock options, and various other things. And so a lot of times, this is kind of the package is put together in a pay for performance type of structure. And what this means is that the manager will be paid more if the company does better. So in theory, obviously, sounds great. The manager's doing a good job. The shareholders are getting more return. Let's pay the manager a little bit more. But this is not always the best way to kind of address corporate governance issues, because a lot of times managers might not have a big hand in the way a company performs. So I believe Exxon is a great example where the CEO, I can't remember, this was he had moved on, I believe, but he had received an immense salary one year, or a compensation package one year, and that was through no fault of his own. And that's kind of a fault of these pay for performance packages, where you don't necessarily, like, obviously in theory it sounds good and it can be very good for companies where the managers make a big difference in the performance of the company, but it's not always the best way to go. Then one thing that has been a big point of contention is, why is CEO pay so high? So this is an idea that primarily applies to the United States. In most other places, you see CEOs are not paid as exorbitantly as they are here. And kind of there's been many reasons that have been proposed for this, and obviously it's probably a mix of some of these. There's no kind of defined answer. And so some of these reasons are, there's a very scarce talent pool. So economically speaking, there's a pretty low supply of people that can do this job. So it's worth more for whoever kind of gets it. Then obviously the job is extremely difficult. You're putting in a lot more work. So the way that you can think about it is that being first in command is a huge leap from being second in command. And that's why CEO pay is so high. Then obviously they're the ones that are kind of heading the board for the managers. And then another thing here is that there is a value placed on having high CEO pay. And what that means is that a lot of times the title of CEO can be seen as a prize. And what does that do for the company? That means that if they make CEO pay high, that means the other managers are going to be working harder to try to get that prize. So that'll incentivize other individuals that are at lower levels to work hard and improve the company so that they can kind of get to this prize. So obviously, CEO pay is very high for a variety of reasons, and it could be these, it could not be these. There's no real definite answer here, but it's probably somewhat of a mix of some of these different ideas. Um, but yeah, I think we can move forward.
So with institutions, society will impose limits on what these managers can do. Um, Formal laws and regulations, informal social norms, ethical norms, it, etc., provide a huge check on these temptations and these alignments. And the fiduciary responsibility is kind of this single most important legal consideration that managers, their job is to act on behalf of the shareholders' interests. And legally, that is a legal definition that will hold up in court if there's ever a conflict. And these CEOs and managers want to do well for themselves, but also, again, back to they want to be respected by those around them and uh, be perceived as a good manager. A lot of times they're in pretty public positions and don't want to be outcast by their peers and or draw negative publicity that could create legal liabilities or affect the bottom line of both the company and the shareholders. And so there's a lot of kind of social boundaries in terms of and informal things that will provide checks along with the legal aspect of it.
So just one thing to add on there. So shareholders and managers, obviously you've talked a lot about the interest not aligning, but now we can talk here a little bit more about what can a shareholder do when a manager does not necessarily act in that way that they should be acting. And so here, a shareholder actually can sue a manager if they're doing something that can be proven to be wrong, going against what's in the best interest of the company. And that is well and good. But one thing that the shareholder cannot do is they cannot go and sue a manager due to a bad outcome. So the manager is taking the right actions, doing what he or she should be, then the manager is completely in the right in that case. But obviously, if we've done something explicitly wrong, going against what should be done, they can be kind of uh, held responsible for that. All right, next we'll talk a little bit about the corporate board. So this is pretty much the ruling body of the firm. So this is the group of people that represent the shareholders. Usually these are the bigger shareholders of the firm, and their responsibility is to monitor the firm. So obviously we know that a lot of the companies that we're looking at are publicly traded companies, which means they have a whole lot of shareholders. And every shareholder cannot have a say in what goes on in management. So what the job of a corporate board is to represent all of these shareholders and kind of monitor the firm. And part of the reason there is that there's a lot of the shareholders don't have a big stakes in these companies. So they don't have much of an incentive to monitor the management. And so a lot of these, the people on the corporate board are larger shareholders, which means they have a lot more money tied up. They have a more sizable, I guess, stake in the company. They care more about what's going on, and they have more of an incentive to make sure that the company is being managed well. And so the board's responsibility is to oversee the management, is to appoint new managers, to do annual checks, and just making sure that things are running correctly, that managers are acting as they should be. Obviously, it's never ever going to be perfect, but their goal is to kind of make sure that we're acting as I guess as company orientedly as we can. Um, and so obviously the board is also the principal of the corporation legally. So they're the ones that are representing the shareholders. So that's kind of where that comes from. Then and one thing here is that the chairman controls the board meeting agenda and direct management to produce necessary information. So this is a big point here because now what we're seeing more and more is that the CEO of the company is actually on the corporate board. And this can cause a huge conflict of interest here because the CEO can be compensated both as a shareholder on the corporate board and as a manager. So it's kind of like they're overseeing themselves. So that can be a big issue. This is something that happens more and more. It's like this is more in the U.S. This is usually not the case elsewhere, but obviously, as you can imagine, this is a kind of an issue that arises here.
And so corporate takeover is a situation where a shareholder will take action against the management by getting enough shares, votes to oust the current management and take over the firm. And if the management pushes back and it's against their wishes, it's a hostile takeover. A great example of this is, I don't know if you've ever seen Billions. This might be a spoiler if you haven't seen season 4, but where Axe goes against Rebecca's wishes to keep the company, her retail company, going, and gains enough shareholder support and board member support to take over control of the company and then liquidate. And Rebecca's kind of left in the dust and done completely behind her back because they thought she was mismanaging the company and that it just needed to be liquidated and move on. And so this is obviously very dramatic, and there's a couple different defense mechanisms that boards will do against a hostile investor, whether it's the high value of companies, which makes it expensive to need a lot of money like Axe to be able to win over the board and acquire enough shares to do so. Poison pills, staggered boards, high interest rates also defend against hostile takeovers.
Yeah, so I mean, just to explain a little bit further, so what a poison pill is, this is when kind of there's a possibility of a takeover. The existing shareholders can buy shares at a cheaper price, so that just allows them to retain control. Staggered boards means that the term of the board members is kind of all over the place. There's different classes of board members, and so that makes it difficult to kind of orchestrate something like this. And then high interest rates. Obviously, in a lot of these circumstances, you do need a lot of debt to kind of go and do this. And so that can be also a deterrent, though that's obviously not something that's very tied to corporate governance. And then reducing agency costs. So agency costs is pretty much the cost that a cost that are incurred because of the differences in the way managers act than the way the company wants them to act, essentially. So obviously there's going to be costs incurred there, and those are called agency costs. And so those typically arise because of inefficiencies. So when these kind of conflict of interest are not managed perfectly. So in almost all cases, once a company gets big enough, agency costs will happen. The question is just to try to make them as small as possible. And so pretty much this, again, comes back to the concept of having a lot of shareholders. The more shareholders you have, the less incentive each shareholder has to kind of monitor the management, make sure that things are going well as they should be. And that means that usually gives the managers more leeway to kind of act in their own best interests. And so in public companies, we see much higher agency costs just because there's a lot more shareholders and less less monitoring of the company, which of course happens by the corporate board, but it's still not to the extent as, say, a smaller company with one principal. And essentially, the goal is to limit future agency costs, and the more you can do that, the less you're going to lose in the future, the more the firm is worth today. So, yeah.
Yeah, and adding on to that, a lot of investors, the reason the firm will be worth more today is because investors generally don't like uncertainty, don't want drama and conflict between management. And so if they like the management, think that everything's stable, there's no kind of conflict, petty drama going on, then that will ultimately be beneficial to everyone because you can focus on growing the firm and the shareholder value without all the dramatics going on.
Absolutely. And this actually brings back to the point that we made in the beginning about entrepreneurs and how when they raise capital, that's kind of reflected. So the value of the company there is obviously taken as lower than it would be. So this is very much the same case, just in a little, in the context of a bigger company. So the same principle kind of applies here. Just it gets much more complicated in the calculations.
So now talking about the efficacy of different corporate governance systems, there was a study by Michael Weisbach from 1974 to 83, classified directors as insiders if they were full employees of the company and under direct control of the CEO. And he found that there isn't a lot of evidence to support that most corporate boards are effective monitors on behalf of shareholders. And this new phenomenon of the CEO on the board can both add and take away from the board's effectiveness of communicating the shareholders' wishes.
And some examples of kind of governance and how it's done in a more practical basis is through integrated business management systems. So this is obviously like just making like keeping track of everything going on kind of more together. So yeah, there's that. Then routine internal audits. Risk management is obviously a big part. So obviously we have risk management in the markets, but we also have institutional risk management and like reputational risk management, things of that nature are also kind of play a role there. Then we have kind of reporting methods. So this one, obviously kind of through financial reporting, especially so through the gap and SEC, the way that things are kind of done there is an example of how governance maintained that's emphasizes the transparency to shareholders. Then board member selection process. So we've talked about how the corporate board is kind of in charge of selecting the members and how that works. And then executive compensation structure, which we talked about. So that can play a big role. And a big decision is kind of figuring out what the best way to structure that executive compensation is so that to kind of prevent managers from acting in their self-interest and to more closely align the manager's self-interest with the shareholder's self-interest. And so I think that concludes our presentation for today. And so now we'd love to open it up for questions if anyone has any.
Feel free to put your name in the chat and then we can call on you to unmute yourself. I'm happy to kick it off with a quick question. So it seems like, corporate governance is really important in times of crisis. It is something like keeping checks and balances. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how corporate governance has evolved or trends as a result of coronavirus, and really focusing on like takeovers and like vulnerable companies in the current moment, like how corporate governance is really important today.
Yeah, so the world economy is, as we all know, in crisis, and with the low interest rates and a lot of firms really scrambling to find ways to stay afloat, a lot of firms are definitely vulnerable, and I think it will be interesting to see how the good corporate governance or lack thereof can uh, influence the outcome and who survives and who doesn't.
Okay, so I'll ask another question. So, looking at the current market, you discussed Steve Jobs and Apple and how they're really interconnected. I think something that comes to mind immediately is Elon Musk and Tesla. I think that's an interesting story, and I think also like looking at Nicola Summer and what happened there. I wonder if you could just give a little discussion on your thoughts on the corporate governance side of Tesla, and if that's concerning from your perspective as a shareholder who really cares a lot about corporate governance, and if you could suggest a little bit what happened with Nicola over the summer and into the fall.
Yeah, so I mean, Tesla is a great example of where Elon Musk has entrenched himself, kind of like nobody's replacing Elon Musk there. And so that is a big concern for shareholders if we think Elon Musk will not be at Tesla for the foreseeable future. So from an investment perspective, that's obviously a big deal just because if he kind of goes, we right now, I don't think anyone expects anyone filling his shoes. That is obviously a big concern from corporate governance standpoints, and I'm sure Tesla is kind of figuring things out about what they would do in some kind of scenario. And obviously, I'm not too familiar with anything that's going on there. I've not done too much reading about if anything's going on, but kind of thinking about that. Obviously, that's a big issue in terms of shareholders. Shareholders need to kind of have the ability to understand that their managers can be replaced because like that's something that everyone understands is not permanent. And so in the case of Steve Jobs was a great precedent. Like that kind of brought attention to this, especially in a lot of cases, and I'm sure that's going to be a big concern there.
No, it will be interesting because kind of back to this idea of investors don't like uncertainty, and the idea that Elon Musk is irreplaceable does bring in some risk and liability if something were to happen to him, if he went and did something else. And so I definitely think that kind of keeping an eye out for what Tesla's succession plan would be a good idea would be a good idea for the future.
Does anybody else have questions? If not, I have another one if that's all right.
Sure.
Right. So I think something that's been an interesting trend in accounting and accountability lately is a movement away from rules-based and more towards principle-based and like guidance-based. So like really you can see this, the gap is getting more principle-based and guidance-based, moving away from its rules-based nature. At some point you have too many rules, you can't keep track of them. And I think like IFRS is already more towards that direction. How does that affect corporate governance, and where do you see that like bringing trends in the corporate governance sphere longer term, as there aren't as many hard and fast rules, but more like general guiding principles?
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, you bring up IFRS. That's obviously a big. That one has kind of historically been a little bit more principle based than GAAP, just because they allow a little bit more flexibility in reporting, and kind of looking at that like moving towards less rules and more principle based can cause some issues, obviously in terms of corporate governance, and that's going to require like we need to address kind of those issues. So this is mainly going to come in the form of reporting information in attractive ways. So obviously that's kind of what the company wants to do and will obviously always try to do. And so there has to be a way to kind of ensure that information is being reported in a transparent way. And kind of Gap has, in my opinion, Gap has really done a good job of doing that, just because and I don't see principle-based reporting being as effective in shareholder transparency than kind of this rules that we have now. So obviously that's up for debate in a lot of circumstances, but that's just my point of view, and that's something that we're definitely going to have to. This is going to be a big kind of decisions that are going to be made across the corporate world and how reporting is going to be done, just because there's some information that investors need to know, and the way in which it's presented is obviously important because it could change the way in which a company is perceived in terms of, whatever it be, cash flow, profitability, however you want to look at it. And it's important for shareholders to know obviously what's going on. And I honestly, I don't know what we're going to see there, but it's definitely going to be something that is an important development.
Especially in when the markets and the economy is in a crisis and firms aren't doing as well and want to paint themselves in the best light to investors, that could be a situation where they're going to lean away from transparency, which is when you most want it. But again, it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds going forward.
I was just curious, do you guys think that in the wake of the current economic setback, there's going to be a lot of governance issues coming up maybe 4 or 5 years from now because of lack of transparency in the coming months or the past 6 months?
I wouldn't be surprised if it did, but I think so. I think maybe not as severe as maybe some in the past. I mean, every kind of big public crisis kind of sets new standards for, oh crap, we don't want this happen to Enron, or we don't want that to happen to us. And so it's constantly evolving. But things do happen, in times of crisis and uncertainty do breed internal crises. So yeah, I would say yes.
I think everybody on this call is probably an investor or is at least interested in investing. I was wondering if you could give us a little insight of what you look at when you're looking at a company and their corporate governance. Like, are there documents? Are there specific, like, really key factors that would turn you away? It's like, okay, like this is a real sin item on a corporate governance list where you would say, I'm going to pass this investment, even if their fundamentals look good.
I would say looking at executive compensation is huge, and kind of how their incentives are lined up and how long they've been at the firm, and compensation, comparing it to different firms in the same field or that are competitors, and how their incentives differ, can say a lot about the structure of governance and how it'll affect their performance.
And I think the Schedule 14A is probably a good one to look at in terms of governance, just to see kind of everything that's going on and from the shareholders' perspective, and kind of what the board has kind of done, the actions they've taken. And so there's obviously a lot you can look at. There's nothing in particular, but you've kind of got to get a good picture of everything that's going on and whether or not the company's managers are kind of being guided in a way that they will take the company's best interests into their decision making.
And if I wanted to find executive compensation, where might I find that?
I've generally seen it in 10Ks. You might have to dig around for it depending on the firm and how transparent they want to be, but it should be publicly available on a company's investors page.